Why is BC Assessment suing one of its retired senior appraisers, citing public criticism? 3 years before BC Assessment sued Derek Holloway, another insider described litigation as a tool that could overwhelm ordinary people because of the cost involved. I've linked to the BC Assessment whistleblower telephone call in the video in description if you want to hear the full version. In that call, he was talking about the homeowners in the UBO appeal group and what BC Assessment might do the next time if they weren't happy with a decision.
Then we will take it to the Supreme Court, and then you guys are screwed, because that alone cost a lot of money. BC Assessment knows how to do a Donald Trump, and they know how to litigate the little guys out of the picture.
Today, a retired 71-year-old former BC Assessment appraiser is defending himself in Supreme Court litigation brought by BC Assessment. Whether the comparison is fair is up to the viewers, but it's difficult to not notice the parallel. He spent 28 years working as an appraiser for BC Assessment. He's retired, he's living on his pension, and today, the very same organization he spent nearly 3 decades working for has sued him in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. BC Assessment's actions have already cost him $10,000 just to respond to the initial filings. That doesn't automatically mean BC Assessment is wrong, and it doesn't automatically mean Derek Holloway is right. But it does raise a question: if litigation is expensive for homeowners, isn't it also expensive for retired former senior employees living on their pension? And if taxpayers are funding this lawsuit, is this really the best use of public money? When I first read through the notice of civil claim, one thing immediately stood out to me. BC Assessment was not only alleging issues involving confidential records and retained materials, the lawsuit also specifically references Derek Holloway publicly criticizing BC Assessment itself. At one point, the claim alleged that Holloway retained records and used them for his own purposes, including consulting and publicly criticizing BC Assessment. Then later, the lawsuit alleges that he misused confidential information to the detriment of BC Assessment. And honestly, the moment you read wording like that, I think many people naturally start asking themselves another question. Where exactly is the line between protecting confidential information and discouraging public criticism of a taxpayer-funded institution? Because this lawsuit did not appear in a vacuum. Over the past few years, I've watched appeal hearings, reviewed board filings, spoken with homeowners, and followed disputes involving BC Assessment very closely. And one thing that kept surfacing over and over was this growing tension around criticism itself. In an appeal board response filed by the Vancouver Island assessor for BC Assessment during the UBO appeals group, the assessor describes some allegations from some of the UBO homeowners as, quote, unsupported opinions, offensive accusations, and even slander. At another point, the assessor argued that certain accusations were deserving of censure by the board. The filing also criticized a homeowner survey response as an attempt to slander the assessor. Imagine that. The UBO appeal group of senior-aged homeowners submitted a survey of responses to the appeal board on how they felt the process had unfolded, and the assessor replied to the appeal board alleging it was slandering her. And honestly, that feeling came through very clearly with homeowner Andy Ross. While discussing those very assessor responses, Andy was frustrated after 3 years of appeals, and he talked about fears of being accused of slander simply for criticizing how the process was being handled. Eventually, he became fearless of BC Assessment and their threats. He said,
the other part there is, how are they going to shut us down? Let's scare us off, let's threaten us, we were charged, we could be classed with defamation of character, slander, just for saying that we think that you're not dealing with this properly or whatever it is, and you should be doing your job, or right. This goes on and on.
So the whistleblower originally warned us that BC Assessment will sue homeowners if they aren't happy. Then later, if you criticize them in a tribunal public hearing, they will threaten you with slander and also ask the board to censor you. That's why Andy was saying they will do anything to try and shut you down, scare you off, and threaten you. Now, whether someone agrees with Andy or not is not really the point. What's interesting to me was the psychology behind it. Because by that stage, the conversation was no longer just about property values. People were starting to wonder whether publicly criticizing the system itself was becoming risky. Now, maybe some people will think those responses were justified. Others may not. But what struck me was the atmosphere it creates when ordinary homeowners, appellants, or former insiders begin feeling like publicly criticizing the system itself could potentially carry legal, reputational, or financial consequences. And that's why this is where Derek Holloway's lawsuit suddenly starts becoming much more significant. Because now we're no longer talking about frustrated homeowners at appeal hearings. We're talking about a retired employee being sued in the Supreme Court by the very institution he once worked for. Again, that doesn't automatically mean BC Assessment is wrong, and it doesn't automatically make Derek Holloway right. The court process still has to unfold. Evidence still has to be tested. BC Assessment has filed allegations, and Derek Holloway has now formally filed a response disputing and denying many of those allegations. But I do think the public is entitled to ask questions. Questions about transparency, questions about accountability, questions about taxpayer-funded litigation, questions about how public institutions respond when former insiders publicly criticize the system they once worked inside. Because Derek Holloway is not some anonymous internet troll or conspiracy blogger throwing rocks from the sidelines. He spent 28 years working inside BC Assessment as an appraiser, nearly 3 decades inside the system itself, and then he retired. And for years after retirement, almost nobody outside the assessment world would have known his name. Homeowners in places like Yubo, the Malahat, Squamish, and other communities began openly questioning their property assessment as appeal hearings increased across the province. Waterfront owners complained that assessments had exploded far beyond what they believed reflected actual market reality. Some homeowners won major reductions through appeals, only to see assessments jump sharply again the following year. At first, these just looked like isolated property tax disputes, but over time, the conversation became much bigger than individual homes. People started asking broader questions about BC Assessment itself, about fairness, about consistency, and about whether assessments were accurately reflecting actual market value. They talked about whether some taxpayers were quietly carrying more of the burden, while others, especially large commercial interests, benefited from aggressive appeals and better resources. And right in the middle of that growing debate, Derek Holloway quietly stepped into the public conversation. He's not a politician, and he's not a lawyer, and he's not a media personality. He's a retired former insider. And what made Derek unusual was not that he was not only advocating for assessment reform, he was publicly arguing something much larger, that major commercial industrial properties across British Columbia were often being significantly underassessed, while ordinary homeowners and smaller taxpayers ended up carrying more of the tax burden as a result. He started saying this publicly in interviews, in letters to the editors, in media stories, and then he went on a province-wide tour and filed third-party appeals against the largest BC assessment inequities at the Provincial Assessment Review Panel. At one point during a global news interview, Derek pointed to a major property that had been assessed at around 11 million, later sold for more than 22 million, and was still assessed years later far below that sale price. His argument was simple. If large commercial industrial properties are taxed based on assessments dramatically below market value, then somebody else eventually absorbs that missing tax burden somewhere else in the system. And suddenly, this was no longer just a local U-boat story anymore. The issue was spreading into Squamish, Vancouver, Prince George, Kamloops, Kelowna. Municipal politicians started discussing it. A Union of BC Municipalities motion was introduced calling for change on how major commercial and industrial properties are assessed in British Columbia. Then another story emerged in Vancouver involving the former Dunsmuir Hotel site. A third-party appeal argued the property had been dramatically underassessed. The same thing Derek has been saying. The Property Assessment Review Panel ultimately approved a massive increase in the assessed value, and once again, the same question surfaced. If large properties are paying taxes based on values far below market reality, who ends up making up the difference? And throughout all of this, Derek Holloway increasingly became one of the most visible public critics of the commercial property assessment appeal industry itself, not BC Assessment. Now, whether someone agrees with Derek Holloway or not is not really the point. The point is that he stopped being quiet. He came out of retirement and became a public voice in a growing province-wide debate about property taxation, fairness, and the assessment system itself. But I do think the public is entitled to ask questions here, because British Columbia also has an anti-SLAPP legislation designed to protect public participation and public interest expressions from being chilled through expensive litigation. I'm not saying this lawsuit legally qualifies as a SLAPP suit. That is something the courts and lawyers debate. But I do think many viewers are naturally going to understand why that question is beginning to surface once they read the filings themselves. Because regardless of where someone lands politically, most ordinary people probably recognize that something unusual is happening here. A taxpayer-funded authority is suing one of its own retired former insiders in Supreme Court. And part of that lawsuit itself specifically references public criticism of the organization. That is not something people see every day. So what I've done is I've made the public court filings available on my website, linked below in the description of this video. You can download the notice of civil claim filed by BC Assessment, read Derek Holloway's filed response yourself, and follow the story directly from the actual court documents and public records rather than headlines, rumors, or social media clips. Because honestly, I think people are smart enough to read the materials for themselves and come to their own conclusions. And in the next video, we're going to start digging directly into the actual allegations and responses contained inside the Supreme Court filings themselves. If this case interests you, please subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.